You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-com strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode. You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast, sponsored by Centre and Greben. More about them later. Let me just tee up today's conversation. I'll introduce you to our guest. Some of you will know him well already. But the topic is common issues with ERPs and integrations with e-commerce, how they can hamper an e-com setup and what to do about it. And the reason for this conversation is quite simple, is that ERPs are often a source of project complexity for e-com migrations and replatforming, and how the ERP setup can constrain what you can do in e-commerce. It can impact things like your ability to process orders at peak and how you want to, and understanding what can go wrong and knowing what to do about it, and also what questions you should be asking to better find out whether the setup in the back office stuff is actually going to enable you to deliver on your e-commerce plans is really, really important. So we've got a guest today who knows a thing or two about this. So welcome, Luke Hodgson. How are you doing, sir?
Well, very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting me on. It's lovely to see you both.
Yeah, excellent. So I'll let you, do you know what, instead of sitting there trying to talk through all the different things you do, I think it's probably best coming from you. Do you want to give people a bit of a flavour who haven't come across you before? What do you do and what is your expertise relevant to this topic?
Yeah, happy to. So, my name's Luke. My background is in e-com and retail. Spent the last 12, 13 years working with and really closely with retail brands. Right now, I run a consulting practice called Commerce Thinking. The easiest way to think of us is we fill the gap brand side where a conventional tech team would sit. So a CTO or a tech director, and then the types of team members that person would have reporting into them is basically what my team is. So we've got a team of 6 that combines engineering, change management, product development and product management from a kind of physical product side, all the way through to BI and engineering. So we typically sit there and fill that gap brand side where a tech team would sit. And we do that through our consulting practice. And we've really nailed that through an audit program that we do. So that's meant that we've worked very, very much embedded inside of some of the fastest growing brands out there. So recently we've worked with like Poly, Stussy, Represent Clothing, Little Sleepies over in LA. The list goes on, and we'll be involved. And it just means that we are overseeing some really, really big critical change projects. And our focus is entirely on the back office. So that's what Commerce Thinking is. My background prior to that, or alongside of that, is I've been the co-founder in 2 successful integration platforms. So most recently, over the last 5-6 years, I've been growing High Cohesion. That business is run by Aaron Capilla, and I'm, I suppose, a bit of a silent partner to him and supporting him as he scales that business. And then prior to that, I was a co-founder in Patchworks. So all of those experiences combined together, mean I'm pretty well placed to talk about the topic that you wanted to cover off today, which was ERP and I suppose how to do it properly.
Yeah, and this conversation came up. We were slacking about this because of a project I've been working on recently where I was just trying to get to the bottom about like order processing rate limits and how many orders should you be expecting to be able to process per minute, per hour, at peak, into an ERP, and where the bottlenecks could be and what could be causing it. And I think this is really interesting because typically e-commerce leaders, and I'm talking those who might be a director of e-commerce, a head of e-commerce, an e-com manager, don't have much exposure to the mechanics of an ERP and an ERP integration. They might understand the data flow requirements and the dependencies for the e-com and ERP, but won't have the knowledge to maybe scrutinize setups or decisions or be able to ask better questions. So I thought this would be a really interesting one. And it's definitely an area where I don't have the expertise you do, hence getting you on. And you said a really important point before we start recording, which is accountability. Often this can be blurred between, in a project, who owns the decision-making around here when there are potential issues or actions. Does it sit ecom? Does it sit in an IT team? Is there an external third-party specialist consultant? And how do you manage that properly? So So I think let's start with the framing question, which is why should e-com leaders care about the state of their ERP? Why should they care about more than just a data flow?
Grebben create digital flagship stores for iconic brands of today and tomorrow. We are the #1 Centra agency in the world, with more than 50 Centra implementations to date. We are also e-commerce design specialists, platform and tech partner agnostic. Try our new e-commerce design subscription. Visit Grebben.com.
I think the critical thing every business leader inside of a brand using an ERP needs to recognize is that if it's working properly, it should be the single system that everyone relies upon for transactions related to stock. So if you're in an e-com business and you're selling apparel, it's really important that you know how much stuff is being ordered, how much stuff you have on hand available to sell, and ultimately how many transactions have flown through your sales channels that need fulfilling. So every single transaction related to physical inventory should be recorded inside of an ERP. So I'd almost flip the question and actually say, how can an e-com leader worth their salt not be interested in that information? Because that information determines, A, how much you've got to sell, and therefore what you should be pushing hardest. So whether it comes to how people are viewing and how a website is sorted to ultimately optimize it so that you're flogging the things that you want to flog and pushing the items that really need to be cleared down. Things like addressing aged stock issues. You're going to go to your ERP if it's set up properly for that information. And then similarly, downstream, if you have done an amazing launch or an amazing promotion and you've got a shitload of sales coming through your e-com channel, your ERP is likely to be between the website and the warehouse or the 3PL. Not always, and I'm sure we'll come back to that in a moment. But in a lot of businesses, the ERP is that system that then is processing and sorting the orders and sending them downstream into a 3PL or a warehouse management system. So if it's not working perfectly for you in those peak moments, you've got a real problem because you've sold stuff that customers might not be getting shipped. So yeah, I almost turn it on its head and say, how can you not be interested? How can you not be taking care over that?
So I think to my next question, which I've changed a little bit, and I'll come on to like why and what the next question is, but I think to your point there around how can a good e-com leader not be, I guess, involved in the ERP thing, I completely agree. But I do think one of the things that over the last few, I think like 8-9 years ago, every single e-com director would have like a level of accountability for an ERP. It might be ran out of IT or finance, but every single e-com director would be having a big input and more responsibility in that area. Whereas I think 2 years ago, post-COVID, when you got brands going from 0 to 100 million in a year as a result of COVID, as a result of like digital penetration, as a result of like various other kind of industry trends, I feel like there's been a new type of e-com director or digital director whose KPI is purely like new customer growth or like more kind of, front office KPIs. So I guess that was one point I wanted to make. And I guess alongside that, my question I kind of reframed was, and I think you and I have both worked with a couple of brands that fit this bill. I feel like there's more and more brands now that have scaled to a certain level without an ERP. And I know you've got some really strong opinions on this. And part of that is kind of because of that growth trajectory, because of how these businesses are operating and they're more immature and they want to be lean and focus on product and brand and everything else. But I do feel like the industry is starting to like calm down a little bit as well. So like my question is, like 2 years kind of after COVID and the kind of hyper growth phase and everything else, and also with D2C maybe not being as aggressive as it was, do you still see the same level of demand for ERP projects in relatively new businesses? And if not, what are they kind of doing instead?
Centra is the only commerce platform built exclusively for fashion brands. Over 300 fashion brands run on Centra, including icons like Paul Smith, Jeff, Avenue, and Nudie Jeans. Centra solves business logic challenges for fashion brands like no other platform, and they are on a mission to help you scale up rapidly, globally, across all online and offline channels. Take your fashion brand global, faster, further, stronger today.
Good questions. Good questions. So I think you touched on it, and I've now got enough experience. I've got enough grey hairs to have seen some changes in the trends and the demands for ERP. And I think if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, I would have been like, by the time you're at 10 million, it's pretty much sealed on that you're going to need an ERP pretty soon. That has changed significantly. I think over the last 5 years in particular, the time that brands can go without an ERP has expanded significantly because there are just more ways of taking a business to say 50 mil turnover, 100 mil turnover without an ERP. And we are actively helping brands in that way as well. I think also the marketplace has just got more educated on what it takes to properly deliver an ERP system. So the kind of immature brands of 10 years ago, a lot of the leaders who were doing it for the first time in those brands have now left those brands and joined other newer, smaller startups who are going on their own kind of rapid growth journey, and they're bringing those lessons with them. So there is inside of brands a higher level of education as to we need to be really careful about when we do go with ERP or not. So I think that kind of answers one of the questions, right, Paul? And then I think most recently, given the trends and also like brands seeing that the space for growing into as a D2C brand and 100% D2C, it's harder, right? Customer acquisition is more expensive. Making really, really good margins in a 100% D2C model and just having that turbo growth, it's just harder. Like it is harder than it was. And I actually think that whilst, and I tend to agree with you that COVID and that post-COVID period may have created a bit of a frenzied kind of atmosphere where people were just trying to bolt whatever they could on to support as they grew. I do think that there is probably a little bit more of a deliberation period now that's happening. And I think that's a positive thing. But I think as a consequence of like D2C getting more and more difficult, brands are naturally saying, right, we need to look at wholesale as a channel. We need to look at physical retail as a channel. And as soon as you open up more like business operational channels like that, it increases the need to have a system that is complex enough to be able to handle those distinct requirements. So I think what we're going to see is actually probably an uplift in the amount of people that ultimately go with ERP systems. I just think it's going to take slightly longer because people are more informed and they know that they can't do an ERP properly without a proper plan, without the proper resourcing. At least that's what I'm seeing.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I've definitely seen a few brands that have chosen not to go down the ERP route due to complexity primarily, that have now changed their mind and are looking to do an ERP basically. Yeah,
and I think that's natural, right? Like, sorry to talk over you, but I think that's totally natural. And I actually think it's a good thing. People are exploring the alternative paths. And in many times, they're kind of like doing a proof of concept. They're investing in this alternative path and seeing whether it's going to work or not. And naturally, some of those proof of concepts will be successful. But also naturally, some of them will be unsuccessful, and people will go back to that decision point and say, okay, first time around, we said we weren't going to go forward with ERP. Now we've got more information and more evidence. We need it. And then they'll go forward with a much clearer understanding of what's going to be required. And I think looping back to the kind of like e-com leader, I think one of the key things that I'd always stress is that in a mature business, you would have like a digital and e-com leader, and you would also have a tech leader. They are distinct and they have separate roles and responsibilities. So how actively involved an e-com and a digital leader is in the delivery and the maintenance of an ERP is different. They shouldn't be the person that is accountable for the ERP system in the vast majority of brands, but they do have a really, really critical role to play in specifying their requirements, testing what's being delivered. And as they do new and creative things or come up with new and creative ideas, they are vetting those with the tech teams. They are making sure that those sorts of things aren't happening in a silo that then create downstream issues with data flows in and out of the ERP system. So yeah, it's probably a really key bit of context. I don't see e-com and digital leaders typically being the people that own ERP, but they have a really important power to veto decisions. And they also have a really, really big role to play in specifying requirements.
That makes sense. I think at the end, I might add a question around the pros and cons of having a very senior, or like at what level that tech person should come in at as well. It's a bit of a deviation, but I think it's a good addition. Yeah. One sub question. So I think one of the things that I've always thought would happen at some point, and a lot of other people have said the same, is that there would be a player in the back office space, similar to Shopify, that commoditizes certain elements of the ERP and is maybe a bit more modular, truly API first, like the Stripe of ERP, essentially. I know there's some like new kind of startups that have raised some money and stuff like that now, but I personally feel like every time any client of ours mentions the word ERP, it's usually followed by Dynamics and NetSuite. So I guess to your, like, what do you think about that? Do you think there will be like an entrant into that market that, kind of reduces some of the friction of implementing an ERP, or like is maybe a little bit more kind of modern in approach? Like, do you think there'll be anyone like that coming to the market?
If I was a betting man, I think the most likely company to create a Shopify ERP type experience is Shopify. If they really wanted it, they could go for it. I think they are one of the few people that could actually, one of the few companies that could actually give it a whirl. That said, Oracle bought NetSuite on the premise that they could be that. Yeah. And they're not that.
Yeah.
Because I think that I don't want to fall into the trap of saying back office is more complicated and therefore a Shopify-like experience is not possible. But I think it is more complicated. There is more variability. There are fundamentally just more processes involved in the procurement of product, the management of inbounding of product, the forecasting of sales and pumping that into a system that then gives you some kind of demand planning. Like, these aren't simple concepts, and they are always different to every brand. So commoditizing it is inherently more challenging. However, I wouldn't rule it out. You like, if I was a betting man, which I'm not, but I would probably put my money on Shopify to continue to incrementally grow outwards.
I personally think that Shopify will introduce more flexibility and functionality in some of the back end side, particularly order management and inventory management. And their goal will be to take some of that investment for the smaller businesses. Like, over the long term, they might have a different plan, but I think that's how I personally think they would want a £5-10 million fashion brand, £20 million pound fashion brand, to see Shopify as their retail operating system, including point of sale. And I don't know if that then goes up market, but I completely agree. Anyway, James, I'll let you ask some questions now.
No, it's good. We're now on the future strategy of Shopify, a free app marketing plug for them. So I'll bring this away from being Shopify centric. I think a question following on for that, I guess this is linked to like changing the strategy of business and the tech they're using in their stack, is that middleware piece. And obviously you've got strong opinions in this because, co-founding two different businesses. But I found this really interesting because I think there's been a definitely a mindset shift in e-commerce businesses away from pre-built connectors to middleware and isolating different systems and doing any data transformation piece within the middleware to reduce that complexity and avoid customization at either the front end or the back end, as I call it. Now, what are you seeing, and what role now are you seeing middleware playing? How has that changed in terms of helping, like, I guess, reduce complexity between e-com and ERPs?
It's definitely a space which has got a lot of differing needs, and there is a place, I think, for lots of different players in the middleware space. When we first started our very first integration platform all those years ago, 11, 12 years ago, it was a bit of a wild west, right? There was only a handful of players, and then everything was up for grabs. If you look at it today, it's a much more mature market. And I think that's reflective of the types of businesses that they're focusing on. So I think you've got, to use that commoditized phrase, I think you've got a lot of room for a commoditized player or players who are saying, right, businesses who have got low budgets, want very, very quick to deploy solutions and are accepting of the fact that they're not going to get everything they want, but they're going to get enough. Here's some plug and play connectors. It's mega cheap, low cost to adopt, if not free. And they'll take them as far as they can before they then say, right, we can't customize this. We can't implement as much logic as we would like. And also we don't have people inside of the business who are able to do that work inside of these platforms. And at that point, they'll then say, right, what's the alternatives? And this is where you start getting into more serious brand territory, where they just have more complexity in their business. They might be doing really high volumes of sales at massive peaks, whether it's Black Friday or new product drops. They might have things like new channels that they're opening up. And they're saying, okay, we've already got this, like loads of different plug and play apps, and none of them are doing everything that we want. Can we try and consolidate some of these into a single platform that then gives us a lot more flexibility? And that is where high cohesion is playing. It's in this space where brands are mature enough to know that they need to do a proper comprehensive job on integration. They want to try and consolidate things into a single platform as much as possible. And they also know that these things require expertise and resource and people who are going to properly focus on nailing it. It's not just something that's almost like an afterthought or a quick plug and play. It's a project in and of itself. So I think what we're seeing, particularly at that more mature, serious end of the market, is brands and the leaders inside of those brands have probably had their fingers burnt enough times with some of the plug and play options that promised the earth and didn't deliver. And therefore, they're just ready to do it properly. So I think there is a couple of tiers opening up in the market. And then even more enterprise grade than, say, a Heiko is you likes of MuleSofts. You know, like the MuleSofts of this world are enormous enterprise platforms with incredible training programs for in-house developers and things like that. But the cost is reflective of their positioning in the market, and they are often not really playing in that kind of mid-tier of brands. Hopefully that answers the question. It's just a much more mature marketplace is what I'm seeing.
Yeah, it is. I think this is the challenges for e-com teams is when moving platforms, you often get a change. It's not just take out the e-com platform, it is the wider tech stack change, and that can be introducing these additional layers, and it can be difficult to understand whether the middleware solution being recommended is the right one, is fit for purpose. So I think people understanding and realizing its nuance, and that it's not just it's not just a middleware is a middleware. It's very different in terms of what they're able to do is very important to ask for. But let's get on to the bit that I'm really interested in chatting about is this you talked about peak order volumes and how that can have a massive impact in terms of your operational processes and capabilities. And I have seen this personally in projects where when people start tripling, quadrupling overnight numbers, they can end up with process blocks, which could be down to how a system's configured. It could be down to how one particular platform is set up to enable volumes to be passed through and the processing speed. And I thought it'd be really interesting to hear from your point of view, what typically causes peak order volume capacity issues from an ERP? Let's take the middleware and ERP setup. Yeah. We talked about things like concurrency limits in ERPs, setup inefficiencies. So what are the common gotchas you come across?
Yeah. Okay. So I think the most common gotcha is brands not forecasting the peaks properly and then sharing the information as well as they can with all of the parties that might be affected by that. Like, honestly, I've seen brands nail peak sales periods, but not be giving their warehouse or 3PL at least some indication of what numbers they're expecting in the first day of sale. So part of it is just very, very non-technical housekeeping. Be clear with the partners that are going to have to deal with the downstream effects of you ramming loads and loads of orders in at the top end. If we then look at more at the technology side, if you look at, if you've got an architecture that places e-commerce above ERP and then your warehousing and your kind of fulfillment beneath the ERP in kind of like a vertical stack with each of those systems feeding into one another, there is a huge, huge emphasis in peak sales periods for your ERP system to have the hosting ability to keep up the pace. And what we found, and Maxime from my team and Dom from my team, they were both part of the Gymshark systems teams for 5+ years. And there is no business that I've ever worked with who have had such a focus on optimizing their tech stack for sales peaks and doing it really, really well over years and years and years. And for them, one of the key requirements was to ensure that the hosting and the service tier that they were on inside of their ERP system was capable of handling those peak volumes twice a year. So you've got to make sure that your hosting is right within your ERP. Otherwise, you just don't have enough lanes to send data into it, and it just cannot keep up. So no matter how fast your middleware is at taking data from, say, Shopify and sending it into the ERP, and how fast it is at picking up data from the ERP and sending it down to the 3PL or warehouse, if the system in the middle does not have the hosting capacity because you've perhaps not upgraded it enough, you're going to have problems. So that's one of the key areas. You've got to make sure that you've got enough concurrency inside of that system, and that's usually linked to the hosting and service tier. The second element is, again, middleware. So like you've got middleware needs to be able to handle that kind of throughput, and the high cohesion platform and the way that was architected from day one was geared up around that. There are other middleware platforms that I know are focusing in a similar way, but I can only talk about our approach. And it's a lot of that is around how you've actually fundamentally architected the system and how you're able to scale up each individual stream, i.e. sales orders from this Shopify instance to this ERP for this brand. Can we scale up that one stream sufficiently so that it can handle that kind of throughput? So Heiko is one of those platforms that's got that built into it. If you don't have that scalability and that elasticity in your middleware, you'll get to peak volumes and it will just not be flowing the orders through anywhere near quickly enough. Sometimes they crash. Often they just lag massively. So it doesn't matter how much concurrency you've got in your ERP. If your middleware can't keep up, you're wasting money on those licenses in the ERP, and you're also falling behind massively in fulfilling those peak sales orders. And then I suppose the more nuanced bit on top of that, because they're kind of like, I suppose, the common sense answers, is how are you optimizing the setup of all of those things in the run-up and during peak sales periods? So one of the things that Maxime on the team is really, really bullish about is how very rarely does a brand go into a peak sales period and say, right, we're going to go live with our sale at 1 minute past midnight, just for example. At 10 minutes past midnight, we're expecting an inbounding shipment of a load of new stock that we want to make available on the site, ready for go live and ready for the sale. So as soon as it comes in, update the stock levels and enable that to be sold. Very rarely is a brand doing that through peak. And what you need to have is the maturity of understanding, okay, what integrations and flows of data do we actually need running in real time through our peak sales period? Because if it is not business critical that you have all of these other transactional flows, whether it be inventory levels, whether it be purchase orders, whether it be inbound receipt of goods from the warehouse up to your ERP system, if all of these things aren't critical through those peak moments, turn them off, pause them, and allow all of your focus and concurrency to be focused on the things that have to happen in real time through those first hour, 2 hours, 4 hours, 12 hours of a sale, and then have the plan and have the whole process set up so that you can activate them again. And it'll have no business impact, negative business impact, but it'll enable you to concentrate all of the bandwidth, all of the concurrency, basically all of the firepower into the thing that needs to be on point. And that's normally orders down and potentially inventory back up, depending on how complex you want to make the setup.
Great. So I think that was a really detailed answer that has answered the next question, which was, what tactics or tips do you have for e-com businesses looking to maximize performance on the back office side around peak? So I will use this opportunity to ask the question that I was thinking of earlier. And I think this is a really interesting question. The only thing is it's, I think you're probably coming at it from one side and maybe James and I come at it from another side, but it's something that we've talked about a little bit on the podcast, but I've spoken to quite a lot of people about post-COVID. So you mentioned hiring a very senior technical leader and you didn't mention at what level they come in at. And something that I've seen certain brands do, so some of those brands that I talked about earlier, so they've got to 100 million very, very quickly, and they've brought in a CTO. And that CTO is like board level, super senior, and essentially that person has freedom, or at least a lot of control around how the end-to-end tech stack is approached.
Yeah.
One dangerous thing that I've seen when a person's coming at that level in the past is when it comes to the front office. I think from the back office side, I can definitely see a lot of value there. But when it comes to like a fashion brand or a beauty brand or whatever else, I've certainly seen some people come in and like over-architect all aspects of like the front end stack, be that like, you know, a composable build or, you know, investing in different Mac technologies, whatever. Basically, they've just taken away like maybe 18 months of feature development or like kind of focus on things that are going to make a material impact to business by introducing this kind of technology change that isn't always needed. And that's definitely not always the case. And like we're working with right now, it's got a CTO and they're the complete opposite. And, you know, they're like focused on consolidation and modern tech and low code and whatever else. But I guess my question to you is like, how type of brands that we've worked with in the past, £50 million fashion brand, you know, they don't have an ERP yet. They're relatively immature from a technology perspective across the business. What level do you think that technology person should come in at, and what do you think their remit should be?
It's a good question, and I'll give you the lawyer's answer first, and then I'll give you a bit more of a detailed answer. But the lawyer's answer is it depends. It really depends on who's already in the business, what is the growth trajectory of the business, and ultimately, what talent are you talking to and what is their background? Like all of those factors are things that you need to discuss and explore. But if you think about what I think of the accountabilities of a tech leader are, start with those, and then you can figure out what level based on some of those other factors that I mentioned before. Like a tech leader in a fast-growing sort of 50 million turnover brand, first responsibility is make sure things work. Like above everything else, they're there to support the operation, which means making things work securely with like minimal errors or downtime. So it's making sure that the operations that the business relies upon work. Next is strategic execution. So they've got to align the business on a really clear, understood tech strategy. And crucially, this has to be in collaboration with other stakeholders. It is no good hiring a tech leader, giving them that responsibility, and then that tech leader operating in this like ivory tower and saying, I know best in an arrogant way. Actually, they're there to facilitate the discussion and align different stakeholders. So if a brand already has a really strong tech-oriented digital leader or e-com leader, or maybe a really strong technically oriented operations leader, it may be that the person that you bring in to lead tech in the way I'm describing doesn't necessarily need to sit above or alongside those people. They may just be facilitating the decisions beneath them in the organizational structure. And then the final one is like enable or remove barriers to growth. So they've got to be the most proactive problem solver within a business. And that means they've got to identify the problems in the first place, help define them, and then drive the operational efficiency that goes to resolving them. And they've got to manage prioritization inside of the business as well. So that means making sure people are aligned on the change and the sequence of change. Then managing a budget. Are we on track or off track? Are we delivering on time or off time? And ensuring that business expectations are managed. Now, those types of responsibilities in an organization are pretty high level, right? Make sure things work, execute things strategically, and remove barriers to growth. So you tend to find that it sits at a relatively high level. And I'm not like mega bullish or evangelical about you have to have a CTO. You have to have a tech director. I think more often than not, when we work with brands, so in commerce thinking, we go in to fill the gap where a tech leader should be sat in the brand side, and we fill it by auditing the business. That takes 50 days. At the other side of that, we'll typically have a strategic roadmap, 12 months to 24 months of length. We'll have a budget, and we'll have a clear articulation of the resources that business would need. More often than not, the business says, you guys be our tech team for a period of time until these things are delivered. And one of the things that is delivered is actually hiring. So our exit is when we've hired and trained and on board our natural replacements. More often than not, I'm not hiring a CTO. I'm hiring a head of systems and a systems manager or a systems admin and then a systems engineer. More often than not, it's a head of systems is the most senior. In some instances, it's a no-brainer. It's got to be a CTO. But that's usually because there isn't anybody with the ability or the motivation to take on that in the existing team.
That makes sense. Sorry, I kept interrupting you there, but you kept pausing for short periods of time. I'd try and jump in.
Because you needed to mention COVID again, because you've only... This is my filibuster. I'll just keep going.
No, I think that makes complete sense. And essentially what you're saying is it's more about same as what I'm saying, which is you don't always need a CTO, or a CTO is not the silver bullet for a brand that's struggling with technology. And then also it's about the person. And I think one other thing that I've seen recently, I've seen two people that have been more from a BA background end up as a CTO, which I think is quite interesting. And I think that comes back to your point around the person, where they're a bit more pragmatic, but go in and understand the business, and then, essentially like be a bit more agnostic in terms of approaching tech, as opposed to some of these CTOs that like immediately in-house engineering and immediately like invest in certain types of tech. But no, I think that makes sense. And then James, I'll let you ask the next question now.
No, just before you do, sorry, James, just before you do, I think that's a really good point. And one of the things that we are really, really committed to is when there is clearly somebody with the potential to actually grow and become a senior tech leader inside of an organization, half of the battle from our perspective as consultants going into the business for a period of time is helping other strategic leaders recognize that. Because if you are not a tech strategic leader and you've never worked with a really good tech strategic leader, there's not much chance you're going to be able to identify the potential in people you've already got inside of the organization. And you might be missing a massive opportunity to build your own strategic tech leader over the next 2-3 years. There could be somebody in the team already who just needs that path laid out for them, just needs a bit of support. And if that happens, that for me is like the holy grail situation for a brand, is you've got somebody who understands the brand deeply, understands the context, has all of the relationships that are required, has the trust of those people. Because the typical sign that you've already got a tech leader, they just need some support and development, is that they're like the glue person. Everyone goes to them when there's a problem. Everyone goes to them because they need some kind of sophisticated Excel spreadsheet developing, and they know how to pull all of the numbers together. Like, there are signs and signals that there are really talented tech leaders in your organization. You and they just don't realize it yet. And I think that goes to your point, Paul. Often brands can fall into the trap of saying, we just need to go out and get a heavy hitter here, and that'll solve all our problems. More often than not, it compounds the problems.
And equally, sometimes the problems are doing and getting stuff done and basically executing a roadmap that's stifled, and a high-level strategic person isn't going to do that without the additional resource. You're right. But the other bit is often the commercial bit that's lacking, where there isn't an owner to do the commercial negotiations to make sure you've got the right setup, licenses, contract. And actually what the problem is that you're not paying for the environments you need in order to execute the changes and support them. So I think you're right. It's the most important thing in all these and all the projects I've worked on is who owns decisions. Like, what decisions have to be made, and is there a clear owner? If there isn't a clear owner, then somebody has to step up and take it, or you've got to bring somebody in who's going to provide that decision-making ability to execute. So yeah, that feels like a really pragmatic answer to that question, actually. It kind of aligns with the projects I've seen. And a lot of them I've seen, especially at the ERP level, is that people have gone for I'm not going to say cheap because it never is, but they've gone for a limited budget implementation, and they've made compromises, you alluded to earlier, whether that is in terms of the host environment, whether it's in terms of the technical support they had from an expert consultant, so that they haven't made necessarily the right decisions in the original setup. And that's brought the compromise from the start.
it's like almost a mirror image of how we've positioned commerce thinking. And we've learned this through doing, right? So when we're auditing a brand, we're filling the gap, or like there is a missing tech team. So we're filling it. And we're doing that to help them make informed decisions, choose the right things, plan in the right way, have the right level of budget, and also the resource plan in place to make it successful. Beyond that point, you're in delivery mode. And at that point, you need different skill sets to what a typical CTO would have. Like I essentially perform the CTO role at that auditing stage, get everything set up, get the procurement done. And then out the other side of that, you're in delivery mode. And that's a different set of skill sets and a different set of people. Once you're beyond that, you're then in, right, what is the continuity? Who is going to be maintaining this? And more often than not, when a brand starts working with commerce thinking, within the first 3 months, they think they need a me full time. Within 6 months, they're convinced they don't need a me full time. They need a Maxime or a Dom or an Andy or a Nathan or an Amy. Like, they very quickly realize that long term, a Luke in the building is, this may sound a bit self-deprecating, it is very true. They don't need a Luke, they need one of the others. That's where they'll get the value from long term. And that kind of goes full loop back to your question, Paul, of like, I think people convince themselves they need a CTO when actually they probably only need one for a period of time to make decisions. And then they need the executors and the delivery people.
That as we got through all the questions, are there any parting advice in terms of if you're an e-commerce person who's in a project where you have some issues and where someone on the integration side has flagged that, oh, do you know what, we can't process that volume of orders in the way that you want to, and actually no, we can't do like real-time order syncs. We can only do every 10 minutes. You hear things coming back. What do you advise them? How should they go about approaching this? How should they go about scrutinizing that the information coming back is valid and accurate?
Good questions. So obviously, if you've already got these things set up and these are real problems that you are living with, it's not like you can go straight back to the start and start all over again. So I think what I would be doing is proposing that people break down the problem. So when you talk about throughput of orders from, say, Shopify to NetSuite, then NetSuite to a warehouse management system, there are multiple stages that throughput relies upon. So how quickly is data going out of the e-com platform, and how quickly can the middleware process it? Then how long is it taking that middleware to drop that at the door of, say, NetSuite? At that point, the way NetSuite is configured in most cases is it will have some scripts and some essentially like workflows inside of it that's then processing that information. That takes some time. Then it's preparing that data for pickup from a middleware to send it down to the next point. So you've got already 3-4 stages that you need to have modeled out. And then at that point, middleware needs to process it. How quickly is it processing the data out of NetSuite? And then how quickly is it dropping it at the door of the API or the flat file that the warehouse is processing it? And then the final link in that chain is that system's ability to digest that information. What you tend to find is that most people massively oversimplify. We have an issue with throughput, and they think of it as either just an integration problem or just an ERP problem. Reality is it's much more nuanced than that. And until you model it out visually in front of you, you've got nothing to start benchmarking people against. And if you break it down, you can start getting actual data from people and you can start to isolate the issues. So that would be the most practical thing people could do, is break down every single link in the chain and then scrutinize it with all of the third parties on the same call. And you lock them in a room until everyone's got to the answer. Like with throughput and volume, it's so precious and so important to a brand. It should be one of those instances where if there is an issue and there is a critical and sort of like disaster recovery, it's legitimate. You get everyone in a room and you don't let them out until that's understood and properly interrogated. And that's one of those.
Yeah, fully agreed. Time stamping stuff at each end so that you don't go through this endless loop of, no, we're processing them okay, it's all right. It's somewhere else's problem. Excellent. So I've really enjoyed that. I thought this would be a useful episode, and hopefully those our audience listener found it really useful, giving some good insights there. We'll drop a link on the landing page if you want to find out how to contact Luke, or you want to have a look at the businesses he's been talking about. Please do, and reach out to him. Thanks for listening as always, and if you've got any questions about the episode, do get in touch and let us know. You're listening to the Inside Commerce podcast, hosted by experienced consultants James Gerd and Paul Rogers. Inside Commerce is your fast track to digital knowledge, featuring interviews with leading e-commerce retailers, industry thought leaders, and the C-suite of key tech companies to explore the latest in digital strategy, customer experience, and tech. Discover what the latest trends really mean and get practical advice based on experience to help fine-tune your e-com strategy and tech stack. Follow us on LinkedIn and reach out to James or Paul if you'd like to discuss an e-commerce project. We hope you enjoy the latest episode.